everyone.
Hello.
Hope you're all having a great time at NunPub 3 and that you're learning a lot and getting to play a lot, and all good things are coming out of this convention. I am Suzanne Zinsley, and
I am Chris Zinsley.
we are Cardboard Edison. We do a lot for board game designers. We try to help designers and the community just try to be the best that they can be by gathering resources and putting it together and doing tips and all that for designers. The thing we're going to be talking about today is publishing contracts. Everything you need to know before you sign a contract. And we got this information by sending out a questionnaire to a whole bunch of designers around the world. So, Chris, do you want to get started?
Yeah, and we have a couple of reports, some infographics that we put out based on that information, and you're seeing that on your screen right now. So we're going to kind of walk you through some of the most important things that you need to know before you license your game to a publisher. Like Suzanne said, this is based on anonymous surveys with more than 200 contracts that were signed over the past 5 years. And so let's
Before you go forward,
go for
I just want to jump in. As we're going through this, if anybody that's watching it live has any questions, feel free to ask them, and they will pop up on the screen, and we'll try to answer them as we go along.
Yes, absolutely.
Sorry.
Excellent. So let's get started. So when you sign a contract with a publisher, you're giving them the rights to your game, and in exchange, generally speaking, what you're going to be getting is a royalty. And many contracts, but as you'll see in just a minute, will give the designer an advance on that royalty. So you get some money up front as soon as you sign the contract. As you'll see in the data that we have here, that's something that shows up in most contracts, but there's a decent number, a little less than half of contracts that don't give an advance on those future royalties to the designer. The amount that you might get in an advance varies very, very widely. It could be just a couple of $100. It could be above $10,000 in some cases, but there's a lot of contracts that really center around the $1,000 mark. That seems to be a pretty common amount that the designer will get up front. 44% of contracts don't have an advance.
Yeah, actually, we were really, really surprised when that information came through. One of the things that we want to be really clear about is the contracts that were used for this survey, they were anonymous, but they were from well-established designers and also first-time designers. So we have a wide range, and we were really surprised that 44% did not have an advance. We really recommend, if you're signing a game, that you get an advance. It's fairly standard practice, and it also protects you and keeps the publishers true to their word.
Yeah, they've got skin. The publisher has skin in the game once they give you some amount of money up front. Lots of things can happen after you sign the contract, and if the game ends up never coming out, you at least want to have gotten something out of it. So let's move on to credit and how the designer is credited. As you can see here, getting your name as the designer on the box is extremely, extremely common. It's standard practice in all but a few cases. Some mass market games, for example, are less likely to credit the designer on the box, but hobby games, almost universal. You're going to get your name on the box, or at least according to our survey, the contracts that have been signed in recent years will go that route. Anything beyond your name, such as if you have the name of a design studio, or if you have a website that you want to direct people to, or a photograph of yourself, those are far less common. There are some contracts that will have that information, but it's not typical. Beyond that, Let's talk about creative control. Generally, when you sign your game with a publisher, you are giving publisher a very, very broad latitude in changing the game and making adjustments to the theme, even the mechanics, before they release it. And the publisher generally has final say on those matters. However, there are a small but significant number of contracts that do give the designer some measure of control. As you can see here, it's like around 26%. And this could take a number of different forms. It could be final say on the artwork. It could be that the designer's original theme can't be changed. This is not something that we have had too much control over in our contracts.
No, actually, for almost all the contracts that we have licensed out to publishers, we have not really had any control. And we knew that going into it. And we, it usually happens with theme for us. We'll give a publisher a game with a theme and they will retheme it. They'll run it past us, but ultimately they're just running it past us as a courtesy, not as permission.
Yeah, they're not obligated to.
And you have to, if you're going to sign a game and you don't have it stipulated in your contract that you want that level of creative control, you have to be okay with that and trust, you're signing your game over to a publisher, hopefully because you trust them and you think that they'll do good by you and by your design. And we do. We have trusted all the publishers that we've worked with, and we've been very pleased with them.
A related point on this is in recent years, designers have made it a priority to make sure that their games, especially the artwork in their games, have a diverse representation. But it's still very, very rare for that to actually get worked into contracts. It's not unheard of. There are a small number of contracts that do have some phrasing in there that requires the publisher to have artwork with diverse representation within it. Let's move on to a pair of fairly standard terms that you're likely to find, either find or not find in these contracts. The first is called a non-infringement clause. This is very, very standard, and this is to provide the publisher some protection. And it's where the designer has to state in the contract that their game is an original work and it doesn't infringe on anybody else's intellectual property. And this is just to make sure that the publisher is protected in case the designer did steal the idea from somewhere. That's not something that happens very often, but it's a very standard thing for the publisher to ask for that level of protection. On the other side, there's something called a non-disparagement clause, and this is a clause that would prevent either the designer or potentially the publisher from publicly criticizing the other party to the contract. These, in certain industries, are very common. In board games, they're not very common. You can see here only 8% of the contracts in our survey had a clause like that. That said, if you, even though you may not be contractually bound from bad-mouthing the publisher, probably not a good idea to do it anyway.
Yeah, this is a really small and close-knit industry, and word gets out there quickly. So, generally speaking, always be professional and respectful. And I think that you should pretty much be safe then.
Let's take a pause from the actual terms that are going to show up in contracts to talk a little bit more about our survey. We did this survey last year, and as you can see, we got a lot of designers from North America. We're based in the United States ourselves, but we also got some designers from Europe, Asia, and Australia as well. These contracts were specifically from 2015 to 2020, and the reason for that is because 5 years ago, back in 2015, we actually released an original series of these infographics that covered the time up through the end of 2014. And so we wanted to do an update And if you're interested in seeing those older infographics, you can find those also at our website. It's cardboardedison.com. So let's talk a little bit more about the designers that we surveyed here. As Suzanne said, there's a decent number of newcomers, but there's also a lot of experienced designers that participated in this. 40% were first-timers. 37% of them had a handful of games previously signed, and 23% of them had 5 or more. Let's talk about some demographic information. The board game design industry has generally been fairly well dominated by white men, and you can see that in our survey data here. The gender breakdown, overwhelmingly male. It's worth noting, however, that in the 5 years since we did our last survey, the number of games that had a woman on the design team has increased pretty substantially. So this percentage here is an increase from 5 years ago. Racial breakdown, similarly, you can see overwhelmingly board game designers tend to be white, but we do have some representation from some other groups as well. In contrast to the gender shift that we've seen over the last 5 years, the racial breakdown has not changed very much over the last 5 years. And then we also have an age breakdown so that you can see that the board game designers, they tend to skew a little to the younger side, but they are represented at all various ages. All right, so we're going to switch over to part 2 of our infographic series, and let us do that right now. And in the second infographic, these are going to be talking about all the terms that tend to come into play once the game has actually been released. So we talked about in advance on royalties earlier. Let's talk about the royalty itself. There are various ways that a royalty might be written into a contract. 3 of them are the most common, and you can see them listed there: 35%, 20%, 13%. Those are all a flat percentage of some measurement for the amount of money that the game sells for. The first is the wholesale price. That's the price that the publisher sells it to either retailers or distributors. The next is the unit sale price. That's the actual amount that the publisher sells it for. And that could be they sell it directly to a consumer at a convention, for example, or online. Or it could be that they sell it to a distributor or any other outlet. Whatever the actual price that they sell it for, that's what your percentage as the designer is based on. And then the third one is the MSRP. This one used to be more common. It was more common 5 years ago when we did our last survey. It's fallen a little bit, but it is still it does still happen regularly. And this is based on the manufacturer's suggested price, i.e. the publisher's price that they've set. Aside from those 3 primary ways of royalties being broken down, there are various other methods of doing it. You can take those 3 same methods, base it on the wholesale price, base it on the MSRP, base it on the unit price, and you can have a flat percentage. That's the most common. Or you can take any one of those measurements and you can have an escalating percentage. And we've actually had that in one or two of our contracts, right?
In a couple, yeah. Which it's really interesting. That one is kind of like a game into itself. The more games that are sold, the better it is for the publisher and the better it is for you. So it really makes both the designer and the publisher push to promote the game a lot, I think. And I like the little gambling aspect of it too.
And it's also, at least in our case, that escalating percentage, it was kind of a compromise position where for us, the publisher offered a specific royalty rate and we asked for a higher rate. And they said, well, what if we were to have an escalating rate so that the first units started at the lower rate But then if the game becomes very popular, it levels up to the higher rate that we were asking for.
Right. And we were okay with that. The publisher came to us with a rate that we wanted more, and we, came back to them and we reached an agreement. And that's, at the core of everything. That's what is at the core of signing one of these contracts, is to just feel like you're doing the right thing and with the right people. So, yeah.
And so then, aside from the flat percentage and the escalating percentage, there are other arrangements that are out there. They're not very common. They do exist. Sometimes designers will just get a flat one-time payment. Occasionally, they'll get a flat rate based on each copy, and it's a set specific amount.
Oh.
And we have a question. It says, what terms have you seen become increasingly normal in the 5 years since your first survey? That's a great question. Let's see. I think that we mentioned, I want to say we mentioned one of them in the first one, but I'm blanking on what it was. Right. Yeah, actually, we didn't talk about this. I don't think the advance.
Yeah.
The first time that we did the infographic 5 years ago, contracts that did not offer an advance were more common than they were now, and it was a majority.
Yeah,
it was more than 50%, and we were very, very surprised for all the reasons that Suzanne mentioned earlier. And so in the 5 years since then, contracts that offer no royalty to the design, no advance to the designer have become less common.
Yeah. And the advance seems generally to be higher than it was 5 years ago too.
Yes, that's true. If we looked at the average advance 5 years ago, probably the better way of thinking of it is if you look at the percentage of contracts that offered big advances of at least $1,000, $1,000 or higher, that was a lower percentage 5 years ago than it has been in more recent years. So sub $1,000 contracts used to be more common, but now it's much more common to have $1,000 or higher.
Yeah. What other terms, like Kickstarter has that? Chris did the bulk of the data crunching, so he's he's the data guy.
and I think we'll get to that. I think that we have that in this one.
It's on this one.
But that's a great question, and as we go through the rest of these terms, we'll be sure to highlight any spots that we've noticed some changes. We'll also, it's worth noting now that we were going to mention this later on, but since you asked, we have these first two infographics currently posted up on our website, but we are preparing other infographics, kind of digging into the data in various ways. And the next infographic that is with the graphic designer right now, as we speak, is actually going to be what has changed over the last 5 years. So we're going to be digging deep into a lot of the things that we talked about, as well as some other things. Maybe
we could touch base a little bit on that at the end of this.
Yeah, I'll just have to pull up the notes on that one. Yeah. But yes, for sure. We have another question here. Did you find any significant differences between U.S. contract terms and contracts elsewhere in the world? Yes, there are some subtle differences, but there aren't too many places where they've been very, very different. There are some things they're a bit more common in the U.S., a bit less common in Europe, and vice versa. This is another way of slicing the data that we're going to be doing as we go forward with future versions of these infographics. If any of them, if any points come up as we're talking about this, then we'll be sure to raise those. One thing that we can actually mention, this was something that we put in our board, or we have a weekly board game design newsletter, and we recently released it to the public as a free preview. It talked about print runs and kind of the expected size of a print run that you can expect from when you sign with a publisher. And there was an interesting difference between European publishers and American publishers. And I'm going to, as we talk, I'm going to try and pull it up because it didn't break down exactly the way that that personally that I would have expected it to. Let's see. So print run size. Generally speaking, the initial print run of your game is probably going to be fewer than 5,000 copies. Somewhere in like the 1, 2, 3,000 range is most common, even though they can go above 10,000 in certain cases. But where we did see an interesting geographic breakdown is when overall, European publishers tend to have slightly larger print run sizes than North American publishers. So we're talking about 5,000 on average for Europe, about 3,000 on average for North America, and Asia, actually interesting, average of 2,000. However, that is the case for all games, board games, card games, etc. Basically, all anything that could be fairly considered under the umbrella of board games. But if you break it out to board games versus card games specifically, the numbers flip. And you see that European publishers, when they're printing a card game, they'll print more copies than a North American publisher printing a card game. But if it's a board game, not a card game, it's the other way around. North American publishers print more copies than the European publishers. So interesting difference there. Okay, so let's move on to more about royalties. So we talked about how the royalty can be calculated. Let's talk about royalty rate. The royalty rate is going to vary depending on how it's calculated. If you have your royalty based on the wholesale price, the price that the publisher is selling it to the retailer or the distributor, then you're likely to get a higher percentage because that is a lower amount that the publisher is selling it for versus, say, the MSRP. So generally, if we're talking the wholesale price, you're looking at the 5, 6, 7, 8 range, skewing toward the higher range there. And then you also, it's common to see them even up to like 9 or 10% in that case. If you're talking about MSRP, you're much more likely to get something in the 4, 5, 6 percentage point range. Sort of in the middle is the unit price, a cut of the unit price. So that's the price that whatever it's sold at. And that you're looking at the 5, 6, 7, 8% range. It's worth noting that one of the changes that we saw over the last 5 years is there was a little bit of a shift in the way the royalties were calculated, but there was almost no movement at all for the royalty rates. So unfortunately for designers, royalty rates have not gone up.
No.
Over the last 5 years, sadly.
Not much. Though we do hear that there's a push for that, of course. We hear that from designers.
Absolutely.
So.
Yeah. Okay, next. Let's talk about how often you get paid. Quarterly is the most common. That's like almost half of contracts. You're going to get your payments quarterly, but that means that a majority of them are pay less than quarterly. 37% pay twice a year. 14% of contracts only pay once a year. And then there are a couple of contracts that pay in various other ways, but quarterly is the most common. Let's see. When you sign your game, you are almost certainly going to be able to have the chance to get a few free copies of the game. How many copies you get can vary pretty widely, though. The most common is in somewhere less than 10 copies, or between 10 and 20 copies. Occasionally, you might get more than 20 copies of your game, rarely. Every once in a while, there'll be a contract that will base it on, say, a percentage of the total number of copies that were printed. But generally speaking, you're talking less than 20, almost in almost all cases. There are a couple of little wrinkles to this, though. Those copies are generally going to be sent to you after the first print run. But a lot of contracts will give the designer the right to have some number of copies of future print runs or future editions of the game. If, say, there's a second edition that gets released or an overseas edition. This is something that we actually have not asked for in our contracts, generally speaking.
No, but going forward, we will.
But going forward, this is like I feel like we've missed an opportunity in our own personal contracts.
We have, which is part of the reason why we do this. This infographic is we want to know as much as the rest of the designers in the industry want to know. Please scroll the infographic.
Yeah. So, and then one other note on getting copies of the game. A lot of contracts, a majority of them, will give the designer the option to purchase additional copies at whatever the price the publisher has set for retailers or distributors. This is something that we've had in our contracts generally, but I don't think we've ever actually exercised that option. No. Ourselves. It was always the sort of thing that it felt like we wanted.
It's a good option to have.
It's nice. It's a nice to have.
Yeah.
Even if you ultimately don't end up using it like us.
Yeah.
All right. Let's move on to the next section here. Let's talk about promotion. Generally, when your game comes out, you're going to want to make a big deal about it. You want gamers to find out about it. However, it's very, very rare for the contract to require either the designer or the publisher to promote the game in any sort of way. You can see the percentages that we have here. Only 4% of contracts require the designer to be involved in promotion. Only 7% of contracts require the publisher to promote in various ways. That said, when contracts do require some form of promotion, it could be things like you need to attend a certain convention, such as Gen Con. You need to do interviews about your game. You need to post about it on social media.
Do a designer diary.
Yeah, right. Designer diary is very common. And so occasionally you will see those worked into contracts. On the publisher side, a few contracts would require the publisher to set aside certain review copies, or a certain number of them, and send them out to reviewers, or to promote the game at conventions. All right. Let's talk about related products. Most games are just the game, and there aren't any related products. However, especially if a game hits it big and becomes popular, then the publisher may decide to release some related products, such as merchandise, expansions, and so on. And there are not very many industry standards when it comes to related products. This is an area that the board game industry is a little bit all over the map on. The most common arrangement is that the designer is going to receive a royalty based on the sales of those related products. But the second most common thing is that they're not even addressed in the contract at all. 26% of contracts don't address related products. I believe that this is a percentage that has declined in the last 5 years. I think that we've seen board game publishers realize that it's a good idea to have an agreement for related products in the contracts. And so it's more common that they're addressed nowadays. That said, even when contracts do address these related products, the percentages that we're talking about can vary very, very widely. Overall, a lot of contracts offer somewhere in the range of 2% to 8%, but there are also a lot of contracts that offer rates as high as 25 to 50% of related products sales, and that is just a very, very wide range. When you break them down a little bit further and you kind of look at what related products are we actually talking about, digital versions of games, the royalty rate for the designer is generally between 20% and 35%, but again, a lot of variation. When it comes to expansions and other game-related content, it depends on whether the designer himself or herself or themselves were working on that additional content. So if you, the designer, worked on the expansion, for example, you're going to get a higher percentage than if somebody else came in to work on the expansion. So if you were involved directly, you're probably talking 6 to 7%, again, with a lot of variation. If somebody else did it, you're looking at 2 to 3%. Lastly, merchandise. This also has an extremely wide range. 5% to 30% is mostly what we saw in our survey. If you'll give me just one moment, I need to take a drink. Okay. All right. Let's talk about international partnerships. So when you sign your game with a publisher, the overwhelming majority of the time, you're going to be giving them worldwide rights to release the game wherever they want in the world. However, a lot of publishers, instead of releasing local editions in different languages in different countries, they will very, very commonly choose to work with an overseas partner. And that partner will handle the localization, they'll change the language, potentially change some thematic elements, or even entirely change the theme. And then they will handle the release of the game within their territory. And so this is called sub-licensing. And that means that contracts, a well-written contract, will address what happens in that case. As you can see here, there are 20% of contracts that do not address this at all. This is definitely a percentage that has changed over the last 5 years. I think that a lot of publishers realized that it was an oversight to not have this in their contracts previously. And so now it is much, much more common than it used to be that these kinds of sub-licensing deals get addressed. The most common arrangement is that the publisher that you signed your game with from the start, the originating publisher, they will sub-license it to their foreign partner. The originating publisher receives a royalty from the overseas publisher, and then the designer receives a cut of that percentage. That's the most common arrangement. About 2/3 of contracts are set up that way. That said, there are some other ways that these kinds of deals can be set up. So if the designer receives a percentage, what percentage do they receive? This is something that when we did our survey 5 years ago, we didn't ask. That was an oversight on our part. And so we have some new information about that this time around.
Yeah.
So what percentage does the designer typically get when the originating publisher signs their game with an overseas partner? It varies pretty widely, anywhere from below 10% all the way up to 50% or higher. Most commonly, you can see here that it kind of tends to circle around the 30 to 40% range. That is the most common potential royalty that the designer will receive, the most common cut that they get from one of these sub-licensing deals. Okay. We are at the last section of this report. And this covers what happens if, under what circumstances do the rights to the game return to you, the designer? When do you get your game back? And most contracts have multiple conditions under which the game will come back to you. The most common is that there's a ticking clock for the publisher. And if they have not released the game within a certain amount of time of the contract being signed, it comes back to you. This is an extremely important term to make sure that it's in there personally.
It is. Yes, I agree. However, an interesting thing is COVID has kind of changed things. A lot of companies have been forced to postpone publishing games or work, and it's up to the designer whether they decide to stay with the publisher because it's in the contract. And unfortunately, stuff like this happens. No one could foresee the whole world shutting down for a year, and so it'll be very interesting going forward when we do this report again to see how the pandemic changed terms, because I have a gut instinct that it will change them somehow.
Yeah. And this particular term, where the ticking clock, where if the game doesn't come out within a certain amount of time, then the rights return to the designer. This is, you and I, we're getting pretty close to that time for a couple of games that we've signed with publishers.
Yeah.
And so we're going to have some conversation, and it's definitely going to be the case that we're going to cross the mark. So we're going to have some conversations with the publisher to find out. We're going to ask them, hey, what are your plans? Is this something that you're still interested in? What would be your schedule? And we're going to have to talk with them about potentially extending the contract or being released from it.
Right.
So that's the most common. There are also all sorts of other terms that can be in a contract that will trigger the rights to the game returning to you, the designer. Next most common is kind of a catch-all term. If the publisher doesn't live up to their terms, this can be various things. It's most commonly if they run out of supply, or they decide not to reprint it. There are various ways that this could show up in the actual release of the game. Next is if the publisher closes. That's a very good thing to have in the contract. What happens if the publisher goes out of business? This is in 40% of contracts, not a majority. But there have been a number of high-profile cases over the last few years of publishers shutting down, going bankrupt, and it left the designers in limbo because the contracts did not have clear terms for what happened in that case. Other common ways that rights reversion is handled is that if the publisher sells less than a certain number of units over a certain period of time. So this is the way this would be set up is if the publisher, they can keep on printing more and more copies and selling it, but if sales start tailing off over a certain period of time and the game stops selling, then that can trigger the rights to return to the designer. There's also a number of contracts that after a certain period of time, if the designer and the publisher just mutually agree, then they can terminate the contract. Or some contracts can be written where if one side or the other, it doesn't have to be mutual, then they could just agree to end the contract and you get the rights to your game back. Another time-based one would be based on the ticking clock kind of begins after the most recent print run. Doesn't necessarily have to be from the time of the signing. It could be if royalties fall below a certain threshold instead of the number of sales falling below a certain threshold. And then there are some contracts where the designer signs away the rights to their game forever, and they remain with the publisher. Those are different sorts of contracts. We have not done that, but we know some people who have.
Yeah.
And in those cases, you need to be really willing to part with that game forever. It's you're giving up the rights for the rest of your life. You're never going to get them back.
Yeah.
And you need to be okay with that.
And they are,
Yeah,
like
right.
The people who have done it, they were aware of what it meant, and they thought it was the best deal for them at that time. So
yeah. And also generally, if you are going to be signing away the rights in perpetuity, then you're probably well advised to try and get better terms elsewhere in the contract.
Yeah.
because that's you're giving up a lot of rights when you sign that form of contract.
Yeah.
Great.
Cool.
If anybody has any other questions, please go ahead and post them.
Do you want to pull up some of the new infographic stuff?
Yeah, let's give you a preview.
Yeah, so we're gonna like Chris said, this current infographic, the one he's pulling up now, is with our wonderful graphic designer right now, and she is eagerly working on it.
Okay, so let's see. What we can do is, let's just get the window back up over here. We can turn off the screen share, and we're just going to give you a sneak peek of what's coming down the line. So,
Do you have to stop the screen share?
yeah, let's do that. We'll turn off the screen share because we're done with that. Great. Okay, so as we mentioned previously, our next infographic is going to be kind of talking about what's changed over the past 5 years since we did our last term, since our last contract terms survey. And we saw changes in a number of interesting areas. The overall makeup of the industry has changed a bit. We talked about a little bit of that earlier, just sort of the demographics. Publishers have also changed a bit. And then the terms that we see in contracts have also changed a bit. We talked about racial and gender demographics and how they changed over didn't change over the past 5 years. And another interesting thing that we saw is that designers tend to be more experienced these days. 5 years ago, there was a higher percentage of designers that this was their first contract. And nowadays, we see more designers that have more games under their belt before signing a new contract.
And we're not really sure how to interpret that. There's could be a couple things. I personally think that there's fewer opportunities for new designers to sign with publishers. I think new designers are generally going to a couple of publishers, and if they're not interested in it, then they're just kickstarting it themselves.
Mm-hmm.
But that's just my thoughts on what's going on, just from being in the industry and hearing what people chatter about.
Yeah, and you very well may be right about that. And another possible interpretation that, like, at least when I looked at the data, the first thing that I thought was, well, it's, we're just maturing as an industry, and there are people who have been in it longer, and so we're just seeing that show up in the data. But like you said about the Kickstarters, there's some data that we'll get into in just a moment that I think actually lends a lot of credence to your interpretation of this. So let's see, what else have we seen change? Here's an interesting one, co-designing. There are a lot more games being designed by more than just a single designer. And there are a lot of benefits to co-designing. We are co-designers, and we've talked about the benefits of that as well.
Yeah.
And that's it. That's becoming much more common.
Yep. Yeah, I agree.
So let's see, but this isn't a co-designing panel, so we'll talk more about these contracts. So let's see, the publishers, they've also seen some changes as well, in addition to designers. So as we mentioned a minute ago, the number of game contracts that were in our survey for games that were going to be kickstarted has actually decreased. You might think that, like, Kickstarter has taken over the industry, but at least when it comes to designer licensing the game to a publisher, the idea that it's going to end up on Kickstarter, that's actually less likely to happen now than previously. And one possible way of looking at that is kind of like, Suzanne, like you were saying, if a game is going to go to Kickstarter, they might just be doing it themselves instead of licensing it to a publisher.
Right.
So so I think that that's very interesting. And it was, at least for me, that was a bit of a counterintuitive finding.
Yeah. Yeah.
So let's see, what else for publishers? Pitching, the way that the designer and the publisher first meet. This was another one that was a little bit counterintuitive to me. Oh, here, let's do this question first. What are changes to terms or other things on your mind for future contracts compared to 5 years ago?
So I think if you're getting ready to sign a contract, I think some things that we are trending towards and as designers we should push for are higher royalty rates. I think it hasn't changed a lot over the past 5 years, but I do think that there's a trend for it. The problem is that very few people are, making a great living in this industry. The profit margin is very, very slim just with the cost of production and how quickly games go out of style. So many games are produced and they're, one print run. So that's going on. I also think that, did you want to jump in?
I was just going to say, another thing that kind of holds back the an increase in royalty rates is that a big percentage of contracts are from first-time designers.
Yes.
And we talked earlier about how that has shifted a little bit, and that there are more experienced designers out there and fewer newcomers, but it's still 40% of contracts. And so if you're a first-time designer, you're probably going to be excited to sign with the publisher. You're probably not going to push quite as hard on certain terms, and so that helps keep the royalty rates low.
Also, new designers don't have the leverage.
Right.
If you're a well-established designer, you have much more leverage than somebody that is unknown in the industry.
Yeah.
I also think that the product having the artistic style be diverse, I think that there's going to be a much stronger push for that. And I think it's going to push it to the so far that it's just going to become the norm. And I think that hopefully, 10 years down the line, it might not even need to be in contracts because it will just be fully accepted. Like that's the norm. Why wouldn't you do that? I hope at least. What are some other things that you think? The advance, please get an advance, even if it's $100, $50,
something.
Just something. Yeah, and I think that's going to increase too. Hopefully, after our infographic and our pushing. What else?
I like to imagine. I'm sure it was not a big factor, but I like to imagine that us releasing the contract 5 years ago has helped influence some contracts in certain ways. Hopefully to the benefit of designers.
I hope so.
It's interesting when if we're talking about here, I'm going to pull it up as we're talking. Other kind of forward-looking predictions. We did have an edition of our newsletter where we shared some interesting predictions that the respondents to our survey had.
Here we go.
There it is. And so these are things that.
Can we share that?
Let's see. Can we do that? I think we could. Let's see.
We have so many tabs open. Sorry.
There we go. All right. So let's see. Let's see if we can share this. Why not? We're going to do a little exclusive here. All right. Let's share the screen.
On the bus, right down there.
For this one. Okay. All right. We've got a new screen to share for you. This is our Cardboard Edison Omnibus newsletter. There it is.
Great.
This is our weekly game design newsletter, and this is an edition that we released back in, when was this from?
Just a couple months ago.
It was from a couple months ago.
Yeah, an exact date's not.
Yeah.
necessary.
And in this edition, we shared some of the predictions that the people in our survey had. And we should clarify that some of these things are they're currently not common, but they potentially could become more common in the future. There are things that people are thinking about in the industry. One top of mind thing is bad behavior clauses. There are going to potentially be times when the person that you are partnering with in this contract, and this works both ways, bad behavior on behalf of the publisher or on behalf of the designer.
Yep.
And if you're unhappy with how they've behaved in various ways, there could conceivably be a clause in there that lets you get out of the contract in some way. Beyond contracts themselves, one prediction that we've seen this a fair amount,
Yes.
actually.
Yeah.
Is less pitching to publishers, less of this traditional model of working with a publisher, and more contracted work where the publisher knows the kind of game that they want, and they hire effectively on a freelance basis the designer to work on that.
It's happened to us.
We've
been contracted before, and it's fun. It's challenging. It's exciting, and it's a great relationship to have with a publisher.
Yeah, but it's also a different relationship. It's in some ways, I think, a little simpler. Because the arrangements tend to be, I think, a little more limited in that it's work for hire, and so once you're done, it's more like the relationship that an artist would have to a board game project.
Yep. Yeah.
Kind of like one and done.
Yeah.
Similarly, some of our respondents felt that you might see higher percentages, not necessarily overall, but for specific involvement in the project. So, for example, if you are doing graphic design work on the project, and if you've got some extra skills that you can bring to bear on the actual published game, then you would be deserving of a higher percentage because of it. Another prediction that we saw was the designer getting paid a flat amount per copy. This is something that we actually did see. A very, very small number of contracts had that kind of setup. But at least one respondent thought that would be more common. And then the last one that we've highlighted here is efforts to give the designer more control. As we talked about earlier, getting creative control over your game is not very common. Only around a quarter of contracts formalized that. But there are various ways that the designer could have some form of control. It could be final review before it goes into manufacturing. It could be some more information about yourself, such as the designer's picture. This is something that you've been interested in, right? Having the designer's picture.
Yeah, I think designers should get their pictures on the box, just like an author has their picture on the sleeve of a book. Because when you go to conventions, people want to know who you are. And, I've been at conventions a number of times where I'm sitting at a table talking to someone, having no idea who they are. And then I realize they designed this game that I totally love. And I'm like, oh my God. So, but if their picture is on the box, I would be like, oh my God, right away.
Yeah. And I think that's also, there's been a push from within the design community more generally to just try and get more recognition for the work that you do as a designer.
Absolutely.
And having a picture of yourself is one way of getting that.
Yep.
Yeah. Other potential things that we've seen predictions for is assurances from the publisher about certain practices, certain business practices, making sure that the game follows various environmental or sustainability practices, using recycled materials and so on, less plastic, those kinds of things. Those are becoming bigger deals within the game design industry.
Yeah, I've also seen publishers donating a percentage of profit to nonprofits or organizations that the designer and the publisher agree on, which is a very positive thing, and I'm all for that.
Yeah. And actually, along those terms, we can actually stop the screen share here before we switch over back to our document. Is that, let's see, where was I? We got 5 minutes left. Great. I think that's just enough time to get through this preview.
Yep.
Where was it? What were we just talking about?
As Chris is looking for that, I just want to jump in and say, if anyone has questions after this, or if there's anything we can help you with, always reach out to us. We're on Twitter at Cardboard Edison. You can email us, cardboardedison@gmail.com. And we would love to help you any way that we can.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's see. The last little bit of preview that we can do for our next infographic. Let's talk about actual contract terms that have changed. We talked a bit about sort of the board game design community changing. We talked a bit about publishers changing. Let's talk about contract terms. I think we mentioned this earlier. Probably the biggest one is the advances. Contracts are becoming more designer friendly with advances. You're more likely to get a big advance, $1,000 or more, less likely to have no advance at all, which is a good thing very good thing for designers moving in that direction. Some of the terms that we talked about, especially sublicensing to overseas publishing partners, we talked about how those are just not addressed, and fortunately, that has been happening less often. Sublicensing goes unaddressed less often now than it did previously. And I think for me, when I kind of look at the shift that we've seen in this area especially, but a couple of other areas, it kind of indicates to me sort of like the professionalization of the industry in some ways.
Yeah. Though I'm just going to jump in and say this, there's a lot of larger publishers that are partnering with other publishers or buying other publishers, which I think is changing the topography of the industry also.
Yeah, and it's not just Asmodee.
No, it's not. No,
it's not. Even some medium-sized publishers have been buying smaller publishers.
And so I think that is changing that also.
Yeah, for sure. Let's see. Other changes that have happened over the last 5 years. So we talked about non-infringement earlier. It used to be very common. Now it is practically standard. The percentage of contracts that have this non-infringement clause in there, where you, the designer, are saying, yes, this is my original idea, my original intellectual property. That is in almost all contracts these days. And I don't want to oversell it. It was common before. I think it was like 70%, and now it's like 85%.
Yeah.
So gone from very common to almost universal. Yep. And then last thing to mention is that we talked about the requirement to promote the game and how that's very, very rare. It used to be more common for publishers to be required to promote the game. I believe 5 years ago it was something like 20%, and now it's down into single digits. So that's an interesting shift. A lot of the shifts that we've seen have been designer friendly, but this is a publisher friendly shift.
Yes.
So I think we've got just a moment left. Is there anything else that we want to say before we go?
Just thank you for watching and for being part of this industry. It's such a great industry. Thank you to Michael Early for helping us stream this, and for everyone that is involved with NunPub and Unpub. It's such a great organization, and we are eager to play some more games this afternoon.
And if you want to know anything more about board game contracts or anything else board game design, you can find all of our past and current infographics and a bunch of other information on our website at cardboardedison.com.
Yep, sounds good. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye. Hope to see you at the table soon.